Hi all, Andy here and welcome back to the channel where we're back with the Ford Fiesta Mk7 today as we are looking to change these rear axle bushes. Now I've been told this job is a bit of a challenge, let's say, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of pitfalls ahead. I've seen a few videos already on YouTube on how to do this, so this is going to be my take on it because I ordered the right tool to do the job yesterday and surprise, surprise, it hasn't turned up. So we're going to have to improvise. Improvising is probably a challenge with this job because it is a task to get these bushes out. But the first thing we need to do is get the back end up and let's see if we can get the car secured in axle stands, undo the back end, lower it down and see if we can get the old bushes out and the new ones in. What are the symptoms of failed axle bushes? Well, for us it was a loud clonking noise every time we went over a bump in the car. I first thought it was the shocks or a broken spring, but these all seemed intact on inspection. However, the axle bushes are a known weak point on the Ford Fiesta Mk7, and sure enough, that is what had failed on this car. These rubber bushes should absorb slight flexing in the suspension, but you should not be able to move them by hand like this. So that movement in the bush is causing movement elsewhere in the suspension and creating the noise. It was picked up on the MOT, quoted £500 for this job at the garage, but the two bushes I am looking to replace have cost me just £40. So let's get going. So you can orientate where these bushes are. They sit just behind here where this bolt is at the front of the rear axle. The rear axle runs across the car and it is solid, although it's got a void running right through it. There's one of these on each side. They sit in there and they push from the inside out, and obviously when you're pushing the new ones in from the outside in, like so. So taking a closer look of where we need to lubricate these bolts. So there's one here on the driver's side that goes straight through the axle, and you can get to this, and this is a 15mm nut right here. But really the best way to lower this is to remove the three bolts that are just under here, which I'll show you in a sec. One here, and there's also one just under here at the front. And these also need to be removed because on the passenger side you can't just remove this bolt because it's fouled by the petrol tank. So it's best to remove these brackets to allow us to drop the entire rear axle. We also need to remove the bracket that holds the handbrake cable on both sides. That's just a small nut, but again we want to lubricate all of this up before we set about trying to remove them. I'm not sure how helpful this penetrated fluid is here because the bolts go deep into the chassis rail. So we'll leave that to work and loosen these nuts up before we try to remove anything. So here I am working in the passenger wheel well, and what I've done first is I've released this cable from its rubber mount just here on the axle, and that is the ABS cable, because when this axle drops down all these cables are going to be put under tension, so we want to make sure they are loose and able to move. The handbrake cable I've removed by undoing this nut just down here. Unfortunately it's sheared off when I've done it, which is a bit of a shame. It's not the end of the world and I can replace that. So the bracket, if I show you, so it's right here that the bolt is sheared from the handbrake cable mount, but there seems to be another hole at the back, so I might better mount it on that. Alternatively, I can probably knock this through, punch this through and put a new bolt on there to secure the handbrake cable, because where that normally sits is round here like that. So I am going to have to reuse that hole. So with this out of the way like that, I can probably just knock that through and put another bolt through there, so it's not a problem. So here is the end of the axle bracket here that goes to the bodywork, and there's two of the three nuts to remove right here. I've covered these in penetrating fluid and they are 15mm bolts. I have backed them off slightly so they are almost ready to come out. I've got the axle currently under a little bit of tension, so I've got the jack in place to take the weight of that, and the way I've done that is I've raised the jack up just before it starts lifting the bodywork of the car. And these bolts are particularly long, look at that, and these are 15mm bolts that hold the lower axle to the bodywork, and the third one is just around the front here. And you can get to this from going to the inside of the arm that connects the bush, putting your hand around to support it and removing this last bolt with a long extension and a 15mm socket. So that's all 3 of the bolts out of the way that are holding that to the bodywork. Now there is, from memory, a securing lug that goes into the bodywork, so it won't just fall away, but you might need to get a pry bar just to start to lower that down. So we'll get a pry bar and see if we can move that. I would say these are essential tools when working on the car. So there we go, let's just lower it down. And you can see that the axle has come down also. It won't drop too far because we're currently supporting it with the jack underneath the axle. Now with both sides unbolted, and by lowering the jack off slightly, you'll see the axle will drop like that. You can probably see that's just lowering down nice and evenly because you've got it right in the middle. Now my concern would be that you've got where the springs are, you don't want the springs ready to come out. So what I might do is put a shorter axle stand under the backs of the rear springs, lower the axle down on the jack, and hopefully that will pivot on those springs and just the bushes will come down at the front of the axle. So there is my support pivot now. You can see right at the front you've got the 2 axle stands that are supporting the car, and then here at the back you've got the 2 axle stands that are just taking the weight from the spring, and I'm hoping now by lowering the jack the front of the axle will come down. The audio on my video has let me down, so it's down to voiceovers from here on in. So once the penetration fluid has soaked in, take a 15mm socket for the inner end of the bush bolt and a 19mm socket for the outer nut and start to undo it. As you can see here, I used the breaker bar locked against the hub to create the dead force I need to drive the bolt. Again, it saves you having to push and pull at the same time. Once the nut has been removed, you can then fully remove the bolt through the bush. You may need to give it a tap out with a hammer if it gets stuck. That's the bolt free from the bush, and we will give this a clean up before we reuse it. Here we have the bush finally exposed, and you can see from the movement of that metal collar that the bush goes through, there is a load of movement. That collar should be rigid in the rubber bush and unable for me to move it by hand. Before we remove it though, we need to mark its alignment in the axle. See this notch in the bush? Well, that identifies its position in the axle. When you start chipping away at it, you could lose its position, so mark on the axle with a paint pen or some nail varnish the alignment mark. Otherwise, your bush will be orientated wrong. They are designed to flex in a certain way, so wrong alignment will lead to premature failure. So to get these old bushes out, we need to take a small bladed saw or a drill and cut around the metal collar. We need to free it up totally so we can punch it out. The casing the bushing sits in is a form of rigid plastic, and to remove we need to crack it so it collapses. The best way to do this is to take a hammer and sharp chisel and hammer and crack the case. You need enough of the rubber out of the way to minimise the support it's giving to the case. It should crack fairly easily, and then you can knock the old bush out from inside to out. Here you can see the axle with the bush removed. The nail varnish mark is clearly visible too for orientation of the new bush. Before we fit the new bush, we need to clean up the inside of the axle. We want to create as little resistance as possible to push the bush home easier. So I took some 1200 then 2000 grit sandpaper and rubbed this down inside by hand. You could use a rotary tool, but I wanted to feel the contours and any potential snags in the metalwork. The bush itself is quite wide, so I put a paint dot on the outer edge of the casing to create that initial alignment mark before we begin the installation. If you wanted to go even further, you could paint a straight line down the bush so you can ensure it stays aligned throughout the press. And next I have applied a thin layer of grease inside the axle hole to act as a lubricant on the press. I have seen people say not to use grease as it could react with the nylon casing, but to be fair, there will be very little grease left once we push it through. I also apply a thin coat to the bushing case itself. As mentioned, the tool for the job never turned up, so I had to improvise. Not helpful on a Saturday afternoon when the shops are all shut and these specialist tools are unavailable. So here is what I did. I took an M10 threaded bar that I cut down to 45 centimetres. I used 2 M10 nuts and 2 large washers either end to secure my pressing cups. So here's my setup. I've got my 45 centimetre threaded bar with a M10 nut and 2 washers on the end. I then take this bush press disc and that goes against the inside of the axle. I would then take my new bush, if this was it, and I would thread that down the bar as well. Then I would take my 70mm internal diameter cup like this that came in my ball joint press kit, line that up. As you can see, it lines up perfectly with the outside of that bush, like so. Then the cap that goes on the end, like so. A large washer, secondary washer, and my M10 nut that goes on the end. I do that all up, so that causes pressure to push this bush all the way home. To begin, I used an aluminium bearing puller plate on the inside of the axle, pressing against the edge that had a diameter larger than the axle hole. I then put the bush over the threaded bar from the outside and offered it up gently to the axle. I then took a ball joint pressing cup the same diameter as the bush casing and tightened the whole thing up lightly to hold the bush in place. Once aligned, I started the pressing process. I can't recommend a ratchet spanner enough for this job. It saves any long sockets and you can tighten it up in half the time. No removing spanners constantly. Keep an eye on the bush alignment as you start the press process. It's important to press it home straight, and starting again would be a pain if it was even possible. I was pleasantly surprised how easy this slid home, which I can only attribute to the amount of surface preparation and taking my time on the alignment. One snag with this method is that the bush needs to poke through on the inside of the axle hole, so the aluminium bearing plate would prevent this from appearing. I did not have another cup the same size as the axle hole, so instead I used a smaller cup and placed 2 strips of metal against the axle hole edge to push against. This gave me enough clearance to push the bush all the way home. And there we have it, the first axle bush pressed home, and surprisingly a lot less trouble than I was expecting. Time to do the other side and then reassemble the bolts and get the car on the ground. The reassembly is simply a reversal of the removal process. Hopefully that's helped you take on this job of fixing bushes on the rear axle of a Ford Fiesta Mk7. If you've done this at home yourself and you've got an idea on how to make this job even easier, then please do leave it in the comments below. And if you've got any questions for me on this job, again, then please do leave it in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, then please do give it a thumbs up, and also think about subscribing to my channel if you have not already done so, where you'll find a whole host of content and fixes on the Ford Fiesta Mk7 and of course the Audi TT Mark 1. As always, thanks for watching. See you soon. Take care.